Hi there, everybody, and welcome to session 4 of Digital Outcomes 2023. It's our last session today, and I want to thank you all for being with us throughout the day and into today's session. Now, before we jump into the session, I just want to kind of frame up what the conversation is going to be about. Cyber risk is definitely a persistent threat for all companies, really regardless of your size and of your industry. And it also touches nearly every spend category. It's kind of interesting how much that has evolved over the years from, not really having to worry about cybersecurity for a lot of things you buy to now it's just prevalent in everything that you buy. So how can procurement do their part? What do we need to do? Well, my guest for this session is Joe Peterson. Joe is the Vice President of Cloud and Security Services for Clarify 360, with expertise in cloud security, and cybersecurity. And just as important, Joe understands the business considerations and implications of cyber risk as well. So in today's session, Joe's going to share her perspective with us on what procurement needs to know to have well-informed conversations about cybersecurity and how this specific type of risk can actually materialize with both large and small tech providers. I think we're going to be touching, information that's really relevant for folks, whether you're buying procurement technology, but also as you're looking at technology that goes beyond procurement and helping organizations with their digital strategies. With that being said, Joe, I want to thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's really great to be here.
I do encourage, if the functionality is working within the tool, because I'm not sure if it's working with the tool, Q&A throughout the session, there should be a bar underneath the video as you're watching this. We've had a little bit of problems with that today. So if it is there, please do send your questions through to us. So I just want to start, Joe, by asking, I know I kind of gave the formal bio, so to speak, but if you could just talk a little bit more about your background.
Sure. I'm a working engineer. So we're a consulting firm, and we are lucky enough to service 11 of the Fortune 500s today. So I understand from a customer perspective, both IT and procurement, kind of what they're struggling with when they, onboard a new vendor, when they start to consider bringing, a new vendor to the table, those sorts of things, right? So.
Well, we have a couple of areas of questioning for the 25 minutes or so that we have together today. I want to start just by talking about the risk elements. So from a financial standpoint, what are some of the implications that organizations have when they have weak security posture?
Well, that's such a deep question, right? And so I don't want to disservice it, but what I do want to do is, I did a little research and I wanted to share this with the audience. According to the latest breach data reported by IBM and Poneman, the average cost of a data breach in 2021 was 4.24 million.
Wow.
So lots of money. And that's a 10% increase from the previous 2 years. So the cost of a breach goes up, and it's not just about the money, because the money is a big thing, but there's other things that happen with a breach. There's, as you guys probably all know, there's loss of IP. So they were wanting something from your company, right? Loss of customers, because customers hear about this stuff and they're like, ooh, do I really want to deal with that company anymore? Especially in areas where it could hurt their pocketbooks. So they think about that. And then there's, the time and money to remediate the breach, right? So it's better, of course, if we can stop it from happening. It's better that, what can we do on the front end to prevent it from ever happening to us? And sometimes that's not possible, but we want to do everything that we can. So.
Do you find that because that's a big number, and that, of course, as you said, doesn't take into account all the reputational risk, the loss of IP, all the damage that's done around having a breach? Are organizations taking this more seriously? Are you seeing that there's more focus on cybersecurity today than even perhaps 2, 3, 4 years ago?
Absolutely. And my hat's off to both the procurement and the IT teams, particularly the CISOs out there. They have done a really good job of talking to the boards about the impact of security on the organization
Mm-hmm.
and why it's not an IT thing,
Right.
right? It's a business thing. So kudos to them for getting those conversations going, because if the board understands, then of course they'll open the wallet for the things that are important, right? And that matters to everybody on the team.
Yeah, because it's an area where I imagine it's really difficult to push uphill, from a procurement perspective, let's say, to try and make this an issue if folks who are ultimately the ones that you're spending their money within the organization don't feel that same pain or don't understand that same risk or haven't been incented by their leadership team to do so.
Yep. All true.
So what are some of the major tech shifts that procurement should be aware of that actually has an impact on the levels of cyber risk?
Okay, so the biggest one that I've seen over the last 10 or 15 years has been cloud.
Mm-hmm.
Cloud literally, and there's been others, don't get me wrong, but cloud has literally changed the way we buy things, right? We used to have big hardware budgets, and some of us still do. That was right back in the day. So everything was a capital expense.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's an operational expense. So that's a big financial change for every organization out there. And depending upon who you talk to and what report you read, sometimes 30 to 40% of an IT budget is now an operational expense of some sort, whether that be SaaS, whether that be a hyperscale cloud, whatever the case is, but it's really changed how we buy. The other thing about that is the access that requires. How end users access that data or those tools has changed. So we used to live in a world that was moat and fort sort of a thing. So the enterprise was here, and then there was a big, IT had done a great job building this sort of great big moat around how they got to the enterprise, right? If you think about it that way. And then cloud happened, and then the pandemic happened, and we all had to work from home just to be productive. So how we accessed corporate environments completely changed, right? And what we were using just to get our jobs done changed. So that required a different set of thinking around security.
I'm sure that introduced enormous risk as well, as we kind of went through that process so quickly without necessarily considering all the implications from a cyber risk perspective.
Yeah, I mean, IT folks were the heroes, some of the heroes of the pandemic, just because they pivoted so quickly and were able to get everybody up and working. And it sort of pushed along digital transformation, again, depending upon the report that you read, maybe by 5 years.
Yeah.
Because, it was an idea and folks were working on it, but it wasn't a priority. All of a sudden it became a priority.
And I'm thinking, who's responsible for cyber risk? And, we talked about the fact everyone has a role to play. Is there typically now a head of cybersecurity within most organizations, or a head of security, or is it still a CIO kind of responsibility?
Oh, no. And it's encouraging to me, something that's happened over the last couple of years. IT, like lots of things in organizations, happens in silos. And within IT, there are silos, right? And you're starting to see silos come together. So you're starting to see folks collaborate more. You're starting to see things like a title for network security. So it used to be the network guys and the security guys. Nope. Now you have a person that sits in between them that is making sure that the communication outside the organization from folks coming, outside in, from folks coming inside out, is secure. DevOps Sec is another area where you've seen developers and security folks sort of come together because they want to make sure, particularly maybe they're making software, they want to make sure that the security is baked in the front end of the product, saves a lot of time, bugs, customer goodwill, all kinds of things, if that product comes out the door and it's mostly secure, as opposed to trying to bake security in after the fact. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and so those are all folks for procurement leaders to want to be engaged with. Those folks may not even recognize the role that procurement can play. So it's important to create those relationships because, of the risks of all the third-party software that is introduced. I want us to just switch gears a little bit and talk about, okay, what can we do about this as procurement, and we obviously we send a lot of RFPs to buy technology, whether that's procurement technology or supporting the business in buying their own technology. What kind of approaches would you recommend in terms of how do we craft RFPs to actually address security needs, to give the information that those folks that you just talked about actually need to help them make decisions around what the risk factor is?
I have to share a little bit here. When I went and got my MBA, I'd never written so much in my life. Like my whole MBA was writing. And I feel sorry for procurement people and all the RFPs they have to write. There are so many pages and so much writing.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, how
Sometimes
can
we're our own worst enemy
see?
when it comes to that. Maybe we write too much.
Don't know. But, this question made me really think. And so thanks for giving me a little time to prep for it in advance, because I wanted to kind of make it meaningful to the folks that are listening. So I'm going to read a couple of my notes, if that's okay. So when you're writing the RFP, you want to think about how that product or service is going to land in your environment, right? So you want to think about the architecture, the implementation, and the tuning. So there's some things that you want to talk to that vendor about or have them speak to when they respond.
Mm-hmm.
Ask them about their implementation process, right, for a new customer. Ask them about integration that they're going to need into your current platform, so what you're using, right? So a good example of that is everybody on the planet just about has Microsoft. And Microsoft has built in some awesome capabilities to their Office 365 suite, and one of them is called Intune, and it's a way to manage your mobile devices. And I'm telling you this because it requires an integration with security, like identification of a user. So how would that come in, and how would that work, and what would you need to do to take it that step further and actually use that tool? What type of access does that vendor need to your system or your network to get their stuff installed? And then people don't think about this, but let's think about the data management piece, right? Where does that data reside? Like, if they're going to ingest your data, where does it reside? How long are they going to keep it? What do they do to destroy it? In the event that there's some sort of investigation or the need for forensic data, how do you get it from them? Those are things to think about. And then on the contract side, you want, definitely from a security perspective, you want to sit down with your legal folks, and you want to make sure that they're baking in language to talk about detection of breaches, cooperation requirements. If you do suspect a breach, right? How do they work with you? Indemnification. And then you got to think about the level of access and sensitivity to the data that they're taking in. Are these the company jewels? Like if it's an ERP system, they know that ERP, and not to pick on anyone here, any ERP system is going to know the whole flow of your supply chain.
Yeah.
Right? Stuff like that is really important to think about.
It sounds like a checklist. It sounds like a great checklist to kind of, go back, rewind 5 minutes and kind of make a list of all the things that you just talked about there. There's a couple of questions that I had to follow up. You talked about the security, like InfoSec, cybersecurity integrations. There's probably not a one-size-fits-all answer to this. I'm wondering how complex are those? Because when you start talking about integrations, then you start thinking about extra resource, you start thinking about resource availability, and then suddenly something that was a really good idea gets stuck in, we can't implement this. Do you see that being a hurdle to overcome?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It is a pretty complex question to answer, and it's use case specific. I would tell you that just as a nature of things, some stuff ends up being shelfware.
Yeah.
They never get to it. And it's not anybody's fault in procurement. They've done their job. It's just maybe the IT team is thin, or they don't have the resources, or it's not a priority anymore to get this thing installed. So it happens. Yeah.
I think, you need to go into a decision on whether we should actually be buying this or not with eyes fully open to what's involved in the implementation, by the sounds of it, in areas that you may just think it's just, connecting some wires. It's not going to take much, when, the reality might be very different.
Right.
And another question that I just thought of as you were talking through those, kind of RFP needs is any red flags, things that you see immediately in an RFP response that makes you think, kind of grimace and just kind of have you worried about everything else they may have said.
Well, so it's funny that you said that, because if we're talking about SaaS in particular, I do have a sort of a checklist, right? And I think about the fact, and we sort of talked about it a little bit, but software spend is not slowing down anytime soon. And another factoid for you guys, something you probably deal with and live with every day, but you hadn't really thought about maybe what the big number looked like. Gartner says that one of the fastest growing categories for technology spend in 2022 was software. And it's sitting at 675 billion worldwide, and it's up 9.8% from 2021. So it's a big jump, right?
Yeah.
So that means we're buying more software across our enterprises. And so software is one of those things where you kind of have to, there should be like a basic, medium, and advanced level of thinking around the security that happens with software. Did you want me to take a couple minutes?
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
Okay. So, back to there's kind of 8 absolutes that you have to think about when you're buying SaaS product. You have to look for security in the product. And if they don't use words like SSL or TLS, then that's a fail. Stop them. If you're not seeing things like encrypted at rest, if you're dealing with data from your organization and you're sending data to them, to their software, right? Or you're using their software to get a job done in your system. If you're not seeing stuff like database encryption or encryption at rest, again, another fail. Stop them. You want to look for secure SDLC. That means that they've got built-in security reviews and they're doing scans and they're checking things out for you. You want to look for stuff like pen test. Those are words that you need to know, because that means they're checking their stuff. They're checking their software before you get it. You want to look for things like SOC Type 2 designations. You want to look for content security policies. Most companies, are using a WAF to detect and stop common attacks. If you don't see those words, ask them about them. It's a web access firewall. So it's basically a firewall for cloudy stuff.
Yeah.
DDoS, right? That's denial of service. If they don't mention it. And then vulnerability management. So those are some big things. And I know there are a lot of tech words, but if security, if software is an increasing category spend for you, you've got to become familiar with them.
Yeah, and for procurement folks who are leading that process or helping the business build strategy around what they're buying, or even procurement buying technology themselves, you can be the gatekeeper of, recognizing that if that does or doesn't exist, and those elements do or do not exist, before you even need to kind of pass on to the cybersecurity team to look at, because it sounds like those are pretty much go, no go from your perspective.
Yeah, they're basics, right? I mean, there's fancier stuff and there's all kinds of software in the marketplace. And, there's some that just doing a marvelous job of making sure that what you're buying from them is just well done and well thought out. And then there's others that buyer beware.
Yeah. Now, we talk a lot about, our last session was around working with small up and coming technology providers. There's a lot of startups, early growth companies coming into the procurement space. Do you see any different kind of risk profile that you should be aware of as you're thinking about doing a pilot, for example, with a younger organization than the one that may be a little bit more established, or just different questions to ask?
Different questions to ask, right? Yeah. There are household names in software in particular that you're going to buy that they're safe and they're fine, right? And all of your peers, call up your friend at, the next Fortune 500 down the street, and he or she is using them, right? The you always go in with and I love small, nimble providers because sometimes they have really cool things that maybe the big companies haven't yet thought of, and that's why they get bought so much, right? They get gobbled up by a bigger firm as a bolt-on to their current services. But there are more risks, and you've got to be more careful.
Mm-hmm. Now, would that preclude you from sharing certain types of data, or just more of a kind of a detailed due diligence on them too? Where you may take some things for granted or assume things with a, household name that you wouldn't do, or that you'd want to dig deeper into with a smaller provider.
Yeah. So I'd go back to who's driving the request, right? If it's somebody, in your IT team that has said, hey, go take a look at this vendor for us because we think what they're doing is really cool.
Yeah.
Then I'd ask them for their help in the evaluation process, because they're going to know some of the stuff that they need to think about in terms of, particularly if that vendor is going to be ingesting your data. So I'd ask them for their help to sort of guide you through, because this is a little bit of uncharted territory for you.
Now, things change quickly. We talked about that right at the very beginning. New threats emerge. Businesses change. They get acquired, like we just talked about. They bring in, new executive teams. Nothing stays in, the same for very long. And the reason I frame it in this way is, how can we as procurement kind of, and not necessarily just procurement, but we enable it, think about ongoing risk monitoring, or doing health checks in the middle of an engagement, as opposed to what I think we more traditionally do when we do health checks is we do it at the time of sourcing, of contracting. You put in place a 3-year contract agreement, for example, and then you may go, when you go and renegotiate the contract, go and look at it again and do another risk assessment, or you may not. Lots of things can change in those 3 years or 2 years or even 1 year based on how long the contract is. Any recommendations or guidance of how you can kind of keep this always on, or at least a lot more current kind of understanding of where the risk factors lay?
Yeah. So this is not that you have lots of extra hours in your day. I know no one does, but this is a great opportunity for you to collaborate with the IT team. And what we've seen done is sort of that basic, intermediate, and advanced level checklist put together, right? And that becomes a framework for your organization, and it's a living, breathing document. I would tell you to have one of these available. And so you sort of know, hey, if it's a name brand that you're bringing in, well, you don't really have to worry about, right? So you're going to have to correlate that with degree of risk, and then use it that way, use it appropriately, but have something established within the organization.
Do you find that you need to have that contracted for, like in a governance process, so that the software provider is kind of, they're contractually bound to work with you on mid-contract assessments? Or do you find that they're usually willing when you come and knock on the door and say, hey, we want to just do a little bit of a health check here?
Yeah, your name brand's no problem. The other guys, not so much, because maybe they're not mature enough. Not that the product isn't good, isn't safe, any of that, but we talked about, the classic startup and having something cool, right? They might just not have that breadth of experience as an organization, and or have the guardrails in place for themselves yet, because they're running lean and mean. So contract that.
Really what, when you do that, that allows, I think it's appropriate for a smaller provider to be able to, there's a cost element associated with it, and so to be able to recover the cost, and consider that at time of contracting as well when they're putting the proposal together, to take into account that we're going to have to do a review every year, or a review every 6 months, or whatever it may be. Because I think that's one of the harder things in a smaller organization, is that when you've got the big scale, you've already got the infrastructure set up internally to kind of churn out these requests, because they're happening all the time, because you just got thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of customers who are all asking for them. When you have 10 customers or 5 customers or 15 customers, it actually takes a lot of resource from an already small team to respond to these things. Again, not because there's anything to hide, just because they can be pretty unwieldy because some of the requests that come from a Fortune 500 company from a questionnaire perspective. So doing it up front does allow them to kind of price for that, knowing that there's going to be that cost associated with it, as opposed to how are we going to respond to this request in the 7 days we've been asked for it because we just don't have the resources.
Yeah. The good news is that the little guys are nimble, right? So they'll craft a contract for the most part the way you want to see it.
Yeah.
And you probably know that. The benefit that you're giving to them is you're helping them cut their teeth.
Yeah.
Right. So they have not, going forward, they're going to have this great document that you help them create that they didn't have before.
Yeah. So they can
So
scale.
Yeah, it's iterative, right? It's a learning process on both sides.
And I think it's important you enter into those agreements and engagements recognizing the fact that you may need to coach and support and consult them to be able to put in place some of the practices that you, if you're a Fortune 500 company, expect as being standard, just because they're earlier in their journey. And I guess that's the nature of collaborative relationships. You got to look at that you're not just buying some software off the shelf and, buy it, plug it in and forget it, that there's a more of collaborative nature with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the other thing is the POCs are super popular, right? Particularly in the software space. And I've seen customers, large enterprise customers, ask for much longer than the normal window of a POC. And that gives not only the IT team a chance to do their stuff, but it gives that chance for communication between procurement and the vendor, right? Before you ever get into the contract thing, because then you can sort of float some stuff up that you're considering. And if they give you a hard pass on it, then you know that it's not going to be something you want to go forward with.
Now, I know we're almost coming to the end of our session, so I just have one last question for you, Joe, and that is, this session has been around just providing some more insight to procurement professionals around cybersecurity risks, how to think about them, some of the things that we can do in our role to help protect our organization from all these risks. Any tips on how procurement can actually increase their working knowledge about cybersecurity, like anywhere for them to go or types of content to consume, just anything you'd recommend so that we can become a little bit more knowledgeable about what's important and perhaps what's not important?
I'm so glad you asked, because we are not short of terminology in cybersecurity or IT, and it's ever evolving. And so I feel bad for the people that are not technologists trying to keep up. I have a hard time keeping up. I mean, I'm like, what's that acronym mean? Right? So there are the good news is there's some great free classes. And I said free out there to take.
Even better for a procurement perspective. We love free.
I've heard that. So Microsoft offers a free 6-module class that's about 2 hours long to take on the basics of cybersecurity.
Okay.
Go to the Microsoft site and find it, right? It's wonderful. The SANS Institute, which is one of the strongholds of the cybersecurity community, offers the Cyber Aces online course for free. So there's others out there as well. But there's some really good stuff.
Those are some good places to start.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It takes 2 hours of your time, and you're going to be like popping off cybersecurity terms, going and trying to impress your friends in IT.
Well, not to labor that point, but we always talk about the fact that as a procurement professional, the first impressions are important. And if you can talk kind of the language of the stakeholders you work with, understand what they're talking about, understand some of the risks, even if you get the free pass, that you don't have 20 years of experience in this topic, but that you have one, that you're willing to learn about their challenges and what they're up against, and some of the terminology. It positions you as being somebody who is a partner, as opposed to somebody that's just going to come and run a process and be told what to do. So those sound like great resources for anybody who does need a little bit more information. Please go and check them out. Now, It's time to wrap up, Joe. So I want to thank you so much for joining us. I was delighted when you accepted our invitation. We've known each other probably 4 or 5 years. We first saw each other at an industry event. So really pleased you're able to share some of your experience with our communities. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and shout out to our friend Amisha that introduced us.
Yes. And so just to wrap up, we will be back with Digital Outcomes 2023 with day 2. That's going to be at 10 a.m. US Eastern time. We're going to kick things off with another 4 really interesting sessions. So we hope to see everybody there then. Until then, enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks a lot, everybody. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.